maybe our first choice when we see something going on isn't to grab a spray or to grab a chainsaw, but to work with the biodiversity and to actually encourage the good guys. So that's what Cheryl, in talking about compost, you'll hear a liberal conversation about the good critters and that live in our compost. So please join me in welcoming Cheryl to the Community Garden Summit.
I think I originally put it together a number of years ago for a master gardening thing. We were doing it at Kingwood. And I thought about revamping it a lot, and the elements are all still there. Nothing has changed in composting in the last 10 years. The information's good. But Jean had asked me to add a critter element, and I thought about that, and so I had a lot of fun at the end. So the end stuff is newer. The beginning stuff, it's the basic compost. Let's see this. How many of you currently have a compost pile? Oh, pretty big group, yeah. How many are just interested in starting a compost pile? All right. Now, here's the big question. How many people run a hot pile? How many people run a cold or a passive pile? Yeah. Lazy gardeners. That's me. Cold pile. I think the only really effective hot pile I ever ran was to make this production. Okay, but it was really cool. It was fun science. So we'll talk about the difference between a hot pile and a cold pile. First off, why should we compost? Well, it makes good ecological sense. You know, as a kid, I could never figure out why people would break their lawns and set it out on the street corner for the city to take away. Or why you would mow your lawn and put it in bags. Even as a kid, I kept thinking, there's got to be third world countries that would love to have this grass to feed their animals, you know, and it just didn't make sense to me. And so many things that we do in gardening, most of those have been sold to us by some chemical corporation, someone wanting us to put things on our lawn that our lawn really doesn't have to have. So it's good ecological sense. Make your own compost. It's a convenient way to dispose yard waste. Why carry it out to the curb when you can put it in a pile and benefit from it? And it provides organic matter, so it's making your soils better. That's the biggest reason. Tools for composting. You might want a pitchfork. That's pretty handy for turning the pile if you want to make a hot pile. It's good for loading things onto your pile. Shovel, because when you have this black gold, you've got to get it off the pile and into a bucket, a wheelbarrow, something, and take it to your garden. Garden cart is really nice if you make a lot of compost like I do. You know, it's nice to have a big wheelbarrow or cart. The Gothic home is optional. It's very nice, but it's not so. And I might look a little like that old broad. I don't know, a few more years. Compost thermometer or rain gauge, if you really want to get scientific, you know, you can do it with the most basic tools that anyone has. You don't have to get fancy. You don't have to spend a lot of money. That's the whole point. So the 3 types of composting. This is my garden, and those are my garden hours, dawn to dusk. Row composting, passive or cold pile composting, and what we call active or a hot pile composting. So what are the basic differences? When I was growing up, my neighbors did a lot of row composting. And I don't think you see a lot of literature on this. They were the old Boy Scouts, and back in the day, they would go out in their garden and they would dig a trench. And anything that was coming out of their kitchen, anything that was left over, they were throwing in a trench and then burying it with dirt. And they did that all year long, and they just kept moving into different rows of their garden. And they did that consistently. I don't know if that was his Native American heritage that made him do that. I don't know if it was because he was a Boy Scout leader. I don't know where he got that idea, but I thought it was pretty cool because all he was doing was burying things in the ground and letting it compost in place. kind of an interesting way of doing it. A lot of times in the fall when I rake and gather leaves, I'll throw them right into the raised beds. And if I'm feeling really sporting, I'll take the rototiller to them right then. And I'll kind of mix them in, that way they get wet, they kind of get mangled down, they're more likely to break down. So that's one way of composting, right in the row. A cold pile. And I bet this is what most of us are familiar with. A cold pile is when you just drag something to the corner of the garden and give it a heat. And then every time you have more stuff, you just throw it back up on top of that pile. I have a lot of cold piles. They're kind of all in one location. And I move them around a little bit. And if I'm feeling really scientific about it, I tell myself that I have a green cold pile and a brown cold pile, and those are my feeder piles for the hot pile. And we'll learn more about that in a second. So that's one of the lies I tell myself. I'm going to do this right. So, you know, maybe I shouldn't teach you how to be liars, but it's part of the game, you know. Here's a hot pile. And this is when you've got an active pile that is generating heat. This is when you don't have to worry about what weeds you throw in it. You don't have to worry about if you throw tomato in it, because it's going to get so hot it's going to kill the seeds. It's going to kill the dandelion seeds. It's basically going to sterilize the pile. That's a hot pile. So how do you go about doing that? Well, you want to think about your microbes. And you don't have to get too serious about this. Basically, you've got an aerobic pile, which means your compost is active with oxygen-loving microbes. Those are those little bacteria that are eating things up, and that's what creates the heat, happy bacteria. If you don't have happy bacteria, you might start a compost pile and it's a passive pile. So the bacteria get started on the edge, and then they get sick, and they die because they don't have enough air. And that's when you get slimy, green, stinky, like when you pile up a grass pile, and it starts to, you know, if you haven't gotten to it, that's called anaerobic. Who has gotten mulch from a mulch dealer that has big, tall piles, and when you go there, it smells? Or when you've had mulch delivered to your house, and it just has this acrid, nasty, that's because it's anaerobic. They had it piled up in big piles and all the bacteria died. And therefore it has that nasty smell. So that's how you know you have a pile that's passive, that the bacteria is dead, versus a hot pile, a pile where the bacteria is living. So here's the different types. You can write those down, and on the test afterwards, it'll be open book, it's okay. So there's psychrophiles, mesophiles, and thermophiles. The high temperatures will kill the weed seeds, as I said. So here's the components of a hot pile. We're going to focus on that, because basically the other two piles are pretty simple. Throw it in a row, throw it in a pile. That's the row pile and a passive pile. So here's a hot pile. You want to have organic matter. You have to have green and brown, and it's better if it's shredded. If it's shredded, that gets more air on the edges. So the bigger the pieces of leaves, the longer it takes to break down. If you run it through a shredder or you run your lawnmower over it first, then it'll break down quicker and it will expedite the whole process. You need to have some water. Basically, you want to keep your pile kind of a sponge-like damp. You don't want it wet, you don't want it dry in the center. You just want to have it a nice damp pile. Aeration. We talked about having to have air for that bacteria. That bacteria, to keep it alive, it has to have some oxygen. The best way to do that is to stir it. There's some professional barrels that you can turn. That will help do it. I've seen like pitchforks that have prongs on it that when you lift it back out, it will. There's a lot of ways of doing that. If you look around, someone is bound to want to sell you a product for it. Yeah. But the easiest way is to get someone with a backhoe to come in and move it. That would be really great. But if you don't have that, then that's where the pitchfork comes in. and inoculation. So what's inoculation? Inoculation is when you're adding bacteria. There's a couple of ways to do that. The easiest way is to grow it on the ground. So if you have a compost pile, if you have a location like I have where I grow compost, it's already inoculated. It's already inoculated. The bacteria is already on the ground from the other piles. The other thing you can do is take a couple of shovels of dirt and throw in the pile as you're building it. You can buy fancy things from the store, but there's no need for that. So, organic matter, where do you get that? You get that when you clean your yard. You can get it from your kitchen sink. We always keep a bucket near the kitchen. You can put anything like, here's some old beans and potato peelings and coffee grounds, all good. Anything organic can go in that pile. Green to brown ratio. You want to try to go for 1 part green, 3 parts brown. Meaning if you're putting in a bucket load of grass clippings, then you want to put in 3 bucket loads of, say, dried leaves. That's where it's handy to have that pile that you kind of saved from last year. You didn't give all your leaves to the city. You keep them in a pile, and then when you want to build a hot pile, you put them in layers. So the green is 25% of the pile. And again, if you get too much green matter in there, it starts to get rotty and slimy and smelly. And you've all seen that before, right? Basically, you can use some fresh manures, and they will also inoculate your pile. They're bacteria. So those fresh manures are horse, chicken, rabbit, cow. Never, ever, ever use cat, dog, or human, because you could get diseases from those. So later on, I talk about how, you can make up your own rules, but that's one rule you just don't want to break. You don't want to use those 3 things. Big red flag. So the browns should be 75% of the pile. Most of the material should be the leaves, the dead vegetation. You can also, if you don't have leaves, you can use like straw. You could buy a bale of straw and use that as your brown material. I wouldn't suggest using sawdust. And I found out the hard way, you don't use wood chips either. Because basically wood chips, I'm crazy, I experiment. I'll try anything once, twice if it was fun, So the wood chips are just too big and they can't break down. The bacteria can't break them down. It takes a long time. Here's kitchen scraps. You got them, put them to use. This is the bucket that I was using at the time. I had dog biscuits in a bucket and had a lid on it. I thought that was pretty cool. I kept water in it and kind of kept it at the back door. I tell you what, I've graduated. I now use a handy dandy blueberry patch blueberry bucket because it sits right in my sink. And then we empty it like almost every day. So that works out really well because it fits right down in the sink. I have a friend in Nova Scotia, and she ordered this really cool stainless steel bucket with a holder that fits on your cabinet. So like when you open your cabinet door, there's this beautiful stainless steel bucket that, when I get really wealthy, maybe, that's how I'll know I made it in life, when I have my stainless steel compost bucket. That would be great. Here's yard waste. Now that's serious yard waste. Anyone know what that plant is? That's giant ragweed, Ambrosia trifoliata, and it's about to go to seed. And ragweed, I think maybe you'll know that that's what gives you hay fever, that's what gives you sinus conditions. People always want to blame goldenrod. It's not the goldenrod doing it. They just happen to bloom at the same time. The ragweed is in full bloom there. It doesn't look like it's blooming because it has little tiny green, flowers that you don't see. That's what makes people sick. So I really enjoyed cutting that down. I tried to cut it right before it was pollinating. And I thought, I really want to get this out of the yard. And it made some of the best compost pile I ever had. I ran it through a chipper. That's a lot of fun too, running a chipper. One of the side benefits. So there you are. Nice piles, leaves, and grass. See how nice and clean that looks? Nice layers. The only time it ever happened in my yard, let me tell you. Helpful hint, I must have made this near Christmas time because I can remember I once had a sign on here that says, makes a great Christmas gift. So chop that organic matter into small pieces. The smaller the pieces, the quicker it's going to break down. The more successful your hot pile is going to be. There, see, shredders make nice Christmas gifts. So this is what my box looks like. You can see that it was made out of like old railroad ties. I think it was there from, or parts of it was there from a previous owner, and I moved it to this location by the garden. So again, you want to add that organic matter in layers. Talked about the 2 feeder piles, and that's where this comes in. Take some stuff off your green pile, take it off your brown pile. A 4x4 pile is what they recommend. 4 foot by 4 foot, ideally 4 foot tall. Stack it about this tall. You will be surprised how quickly it'll go down to 2 foot. When it starts working, it just kind of collapses upon itself. There are professional options, and I'm not sure why anyone would want to use these. And finally someone said, well, I live in a subdivision and they don't want me putting compost out in the yard. You know, they don't want to see a pile like that. I say put it someplace and hide it, grow some vines around it or something. Because I've tried these, my husband made me one, and all I could find is it was inconvenient to try to load it in the door. It was inconvenient to try to get it out. I just didn't use it. That's what happens. You pay a lot of money for these professional things and then you just don't use it. The only thing that was nice is it had a crank handle, and that's a lot easier than using the pitchfork to turn a pot. But for my money, it just wasn't worth my money, especially at $500. Here we're back to this compost pile, water well. I'm a lazy, lazy woman. I'm just going to admit that now, and the easiest way I found to water this compost pile was with a sprinkler, because you got a nice, even watering, and that's what I'd do. I'd set a sprinkler on it when it looked like it was dry. So, helpful hint, use a sprinkler or hand one. Or you can even kind of just stick the hose in the pile, turn it on, let it run an hour or two, turn it off. Then you watch the pile go to work. And this is what's amazing. When that pile starts working, and it has the right components, it gets steaming. Literally, you can't imagine the steam coming off these piles. It's pretty cool. In about a week after it's been steaming, you burn up all the oxygen in the pile. That's when you have to turn it. Start to cool down, you know it's not working anymore. Then you have to get out your pitchfork and you do aerobics, not only for your body, but for the pile. So it's really good exercise. And when you do this, if you send me $5, we'll consider it a gym plan. This is also a really good time to find all those misplaced tools. When we start turning that pile, you never know what kind of hand trowel, what kind of hand hoe might show up in that pile. Here's a word on worms. Now, how many people think that worms are great in compost pile? Show of hands? Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's what they used to tell us. They said, well, put those worms in the compost pile. If you're running a hot pile, you're going to have cooked worms. They're going to be real dead real quick. The other thing that we found is they've always said, we were told that worms are great for our gardens, they're great for our yards, they're healthy, blah, blah, blah. Well, we're finding out now, not true. In fact, any place that has been glaciated, which is this part of Ohio, has no native worms. We don't have any worms in our soil naturally. And the worms change the soil, the worms change the consistency of the soil. We always thought that it opened the soil up to make it breathe. Now studies are showing that, you know what happens when the worms go to the bathroom? It's called concretions. It makes it very hard. And so they're not as beneficial as what we were thinking that they were. The science on worms has completely turned around. If you're interested in that whole area, go to the Great Lakes Worms Watch. And they're finding out that worms are really very, very bad for native areas. So if you've got a forest like Mohican and you get worms in that area, it really has a devastating impact. And you can see the difference between a forest with and without worms. So that's an interesting site if you're interested in that particular critter. A word on worms, they shouldn't be there. So we're back to watering. Got to take a little time, do a little aeration, a little watering. Halfway there. Remember that green to brown soil ratio as you build it up. Keep it moist and aerate for maximum what? Aerobic activity. If you don't have a chipper shredder, this is a trick that I learned. This was before my dad let me use his chipper. I've got one of those little Manus rototillers, and as things were breaking up pretty good, I would just take my rototiller. It's kind of fun too. So you can really break up that pile with a little rototiller. That helps aerate it. I told you I'm a lazy, lazy woman. So you just continue to turn it and use it until you've got the color and the tilt that's desired. Remember, there are no compost police. Go ahead and experiment. Try what, pleases you. Like I say, the best pile I ever had that great big tall ragweed in it. That was fun. I've asked questions before, like I have a lot of milkweed. I grow caterpillars for monarchs. And as it gets older, I cut it back because I want it to come back and resprout and be young. Now, I've often wondered if that milkweed is harmful for the pile. I've never been able to find the answer for that. So that's one thing that you say, should I throw that on my pile or not? If you put chemicals on your lawn, you don't want that in your pile. You don't want to put that grass from your lawn with chemicals in it in your pile, because now you're shoveling lawn-killing, lawn chemicals into your garden. You're going to eat that again in your tomatoes or whatever. That's not a good idea. So don't be using chemicals on the things that you're going to put in your pile. That's my only 2 rules, cat and cat, dog, human manure. That's a no-no. Here's what I found. I can empty my shop vac into my compost pile. Well, that's a pretty good place to go. One of the things is dog hair. We used to shop vac in the garage. We get a lot of dog hair, and dog hair is really good in a compost pile. Breaks down well. This was back when my kids were at home. I had a real surprise. I found my barrette, I found a pin, my daughter had cleaned the car. And I guess it was too much work to take those things out of my car. She just swept them up. Didn't think Mom would find out, did she? The kid's now 28 and I'm still showing these pictures. So here you are, get ready to grow. There's the compost, all done, made. Isn't that great? Black, rich, perfect. Didn't cost me a penny. The flowers love it, the vegetables love it. It's great. It's organic gardening. Not only the flowers and the vegetables, but the butterflies love it. Anyone who knows me knows I can't put a program together without putting a few butterflies sprinkled through it. This particular butterfly is a red spotted purple, and they particularly like what we call green manure, which is compost. And they will actually come to your compost pile and nectar. I love compost. So let's talk about some of those critters in your compost. This was a great picture I found on the web, and I don't think we're going to study it too close. But if you've run a compost pile, you notice that you might have things in that pile. You might have roly-polies, you know what I'm talking about, pill bugs, sow bugs. You might have, there's a great bug called a springtail. You may or may not even see them. Of course, they've got earthworms in this pile, all kinds of beetles. Many, many things can be in your compost pile, and most of those things are probably breaking it down. Again, if you're running a really hot pile, you're not going to have those critters in there. What will happen is they will either be in the pile before it gets hot, or after it's cooled down, after the pile's done, then you'll see these detrivores. They're basically eating dead pieces of organic matter. Don't worry about it. It's okay. Nature is filled with bugs. And a lot of them are beneficial. It's not something that you want to panic about. You really don't want to try to use chemicals on it. That's one thing they warn you about. Think about a compost pile. I often like to describe the human digestive system as the same as a compost pile. You know, in your stomach and in your bowels, you have billions and billions and billions of bacteria. And they're breaking things down. They're working for you. Did you know 90% of your body is bacteria? It's not even you. It's other critters. It's bacteria. They're teeny tiny celled animals. You know, things breaking things down. Compost pile is just like that. So it's okay to have some of these things in there breaking that material down. That's part of nature. Cold piles can have some insects again, like springtail sow bugs. Never control the critters with insecticides. Basically, it's going to not only disrupt the breakdown time, you're going to be putting those insecticides back out on your garden and then eating them. Not a good plan. Meat, fat, dead animals, including slugs or oils, if you have any slugs laying around, you don't want to put those on your pile. And one of the main reasons you don't want to put meat or those things in your pile is you could attract critters that you don't want. You could attract rats. You know, when you're laying things out in your pile, it's best if you cover it up. If you're putting fresh things on a pile, cover it up so it's not attractive to animals that you don't want. But you definitely don't want to put any of those things like meat, fat, dead animals. Kind of a no-no. Makes your neighbors uncomfortable too. So let's talk about that organic garden. You know, we all love to grow beautiful things. And I used to grow roses, but I learned something. When I powdered the roses, you use these wonderful insecticides, and they have this message on them that says, kills Japanese beetles, aphids, hornworms. You know what they forget to tell you? It kills butterflies, kills bees, will kill your pollinators. So don't use them. That's the best advice I can give you. Don't use them, don't have them in your yard, don't put them in your compost. Things will start to equalize, and you'll have better success in your garden, and you'll be able to eat things without worrying about what kind of poisons are on it. This is I think it's a question mark. It's a question mark or a comma. They're very similar, and the best way you can tell those two butterflies is when they're closed up. It's the marking on the inside. So looking at the top side, I think it's a comma, I guess. Anyways, they love to come out, and in the fall, see it's on dead leaves. Again, if you've got organic gardening, you can have butterflies. You can enjoy these insects and not worry about killing them off. Let's have a word about stinging insects. I put in this particular picture because this is a ground hornet. And this is the one place where I say enough. I've had ground hornets before. I have a friend, Dave Duncan, gets a call when I have ground hornets. I let Dave Duncan take care of it because he's a professional. He knows what he's doing with pesticides. There are times that he's come out and froze them and then dug them up at night. That sounds a little creepy, but you know, it's okay if it gets rid of them. That's something you don't want to mess with. I'm not saying that they are attracted to compost. That's not a concern that I have, but I have seen them in the garden before. And it would not be unlikely that they might build a nest by compost. So that's something that you want to look at and you want to judge. If you have ground hornets, I don't think that's a job for the novice. So remember that. This is a bumblebee. If you have bumblebees, you ought to be happy. That's what pollinates your tomatoes. So most of these insects, bees, honeybees, bumblebees, I'm allergic to them. So I pay pretty close attention to where they are in my garden. But I'm really not afraid of them because when they're in my garden working, when they're on flowers, when they're on vegetables, they're really not aggressive. It's not a problem. I pay attention to where they are and it's not a problem. So have a little respect for those flying critters. Sometimes I think if the pile is wet, if a compost pile is wet, you've watered it if you've had, not if you've had rain because they wouldn't come in, but if it's a really, really dry dry season, if you're having a dry summer and you've watered a pile, I think you could get bees or hornets or bumblebees coming to the pile to drink water. So as soon as that pile gets dry, they'll go away again. So don't panic in a situation like that. Try to pay attention, observe, what are they doing? Are they here drinking in a dry period, or are they here to stay? And that's where you make your judgment. Snakes. Oh, you know, for a long time, I never admitted to this. I never told people it can happen. And it did happen one time. I had a cold pile, passive pile, and I didn't even know it happened until I went out and I found these round eggs. Has anyone ever seen turtle shells like along the bike trail where the snapping turtles will come? Yeah, you've seen them and they look like they're kind of white, rubbery. Well, I had these little white rubbery eggs and they were empty and they were laying by the compost pile. They were all dug up. And I talked to some of my friends that are reptile experts. Well, first off, they were so delighted. I was so lucky to have snakes. Snakes really are good. They eat mice and a lot of things that you don't want in your yard, mice and voles. So they said that a skunk probably had dug the eggs out where I could see them, but because every little egg had a nice, neat slit, that meant that the snakes were successfully hatched. So the snakes hatched out. They said that the liquid inside the egg is just really, smells like perfume to a skunk. And so a skunk probably came over and dug them up to try to see if they had any baby snakes that they could eat. Did you know skunks eat snakes? Now you do. They'll eat snakes and they'll eat snake eggs. So now you like skunks a little better, don't you? Okay, so that's how they got dug up. And I really didn't know they were there. Here's my policy with snakes in the garden. I do have them. My friends that are reptile people say, that's really great. That means you've got a pretty good balance in your yard, you've got a good environment, it's healthy, or you wouldn't have them. So that's good. And my deal is if I see a snake there, that's okay. I just don't like the discovery phase. So, maybe I should tie little bells on them or something. That would be good. Once I know where they are, I'm okay. This is my daughter. This is the one that cleaned the car with the shop vac, Here she was in high school. You see the snake she's holding? Now really, are you going to be afraid of a snake that big? It gave us a lot of entertainment that summer. It would get up every day and lay on the same flower and sun. And she'd go out and handle it. It was great. She was really excited about it. So passive piles could be active. They could possibly have a snake in there. This one definitely had a skunk in it one time. I went out by the passive pile and I was shoveling some stuff off the edge of it. It had composted pretty well over winter, and I saw the pile move a little. So I moved a little. And pretty soon I saw a head pop out of the pile. So I decided I had other chores to do in the garden. I wasn't in that big a hurry. And I told my husband that I could use some compost if he'd like to. He didn't fall for that. The skunk moved away. The next day it was gone. I think it was just taking a nap in there. If you disturb the pile, skunks are nocturnal. If it was gone at night and you did something to disturb the pile or change it, I think you could dissuade the skunk not to come back. I've not ever had a problem with it. One time in my pile, in 15, 20 years, one snake in my pile, 15, 20 years. It's nature. Claiming the shrew. Skunks eat shrews. You have shrews or moles in your yard, that's what the skunks are doing. They also eat grubs. So if you're not using lawn chemicals and you have an invasion of things digging up your yard, it's probably a skunk taking the grubs out. I had an American crow. They've been coming to my compost pile this winter. I love crows. They are really intelligent birds. And so I wanted the crows, and I'll admit I've thrown stuff out on the pile and not covered it up because I was kind of attracting those crows in. And one of the coolest things is I saw a crow in the yard, and can you see what's in his feet? He's got a vole. Can you see the little red nose? Yeah, that crow caught a vole in my yard. He can come back anytime he wants. He's my pal. So there's some critters in your compost that you didn't expect to get, right? Raccoons are awfully cute when they're little. Has anyone had experience with raccoons here? I can tell you, if you have raccoons that come out in your yard and you're even thinking about it, don't. Walk away. Run away from cute little baby raccoons. And if you can't run, poke your eyes out so you can't see them, because this never ends well. If you take in a baby raccoon, these guys had a sick brother, and I was dumb enough to try to take care of him. You know, so it was a week of my life taking care of an animal that conked out anyways. It's just not a good idea. It's probably against ODNR laws. And invariably, raccoons are, boy, they're cute to look at, but they can cause a lot of problems around your yard. So the biggest thing you have to do is realize when you invite nature in, you're inviting nature in. And if I'm filling my bird feeders every day, day after day after day, you know I'm getting squirrels. At night I'm getting flying squirrels. In the spring, I have seen mother raccoons come to the bird feeder and eat when they're desperate, when they're really hungry, in the daytime even, if they're really hungry. If you live in an area that you have deer, I have friends that might get deer at their feeders. Here's the way I've learned to handle this. Only put out enough food for the birds during the day. If you let the feeders go dry at night, you're far less likely to have all those other pesky critters. They're cute to look at, but when they move into your property and start, working at your bird feeder, then they aren't so cute. So a lot of these issues we bring on ourselves. So again, if you start to invite nature in, and I love to watch nature, I go out and photograph it. I don't mind a skunk in my yard. I pay attention to where it is. I don't mind a snake in my yard. I'm watching what it's doing. I pay attention to the bees. It's all a part of life and nature. So again, if you're having problems with wildlife, you may be the problem. The problem's probably not the wildlife. Start thinking about what you've done that's different, that you encourage that wildlife to come and be a nuisance. So warning, composting might complicate your life. It might make you think more about your soil. It might make you think a lot more about your insects. It might make you think about wildlife. You may even become overly involved in nurturing life and nature in your own realm. Because that's what I love to do. I love to go out to my garden and watch the interaction between the dragonflies eating the non-beneficial insects in my garden. And along with that, if you really aren't careful, well, there you go. See, there's a bee that I was looking at. This is, do you see this? This is a little teeny tiny spring bee. There are bees, native bees that come out in the springtime that only pollinate those really early flowers, and you won't see them again all year. That's not a bumblebee. That's a little teeny tiny bee that just works on these trout lilies and spring beauties. You start paying attention to those when you get really in touch with your garden. You might also nurture a budding scientist. And this is the coolest thing that happened in my life. Here's that daughter that was handling a snake. I guess she lived through that and thought that was okay, because now she swims with sharks. She's an aquatic biologist, and she got an interest in animals and science right in our own backyard. And that's the greatest gift you can give to someone. So composting, it's clean, free, and environmentally sound. And I hope you enjoy some in your own scientific lab at home. Thank you.
We have a couple of minutes before we draw for fabulous store prizes. Can we entertain some questions about compost?
Yes.
Sitting here listening to you speaking, I realized that my husband put the dog stuff on the pile from how long you have to wait, do I have to dig it out and start again? It's a fairly big pile.
Okay, the question is, she's realizing that maybe the helpful husband put some dog waste on the pile. I'll tell you a great dog waste story when we answer the question. How long does she have to wait? What's she gonna do? Here's my best advice, and I've never read anything about this. This is what I would get. I would say if you have landscaping, if you have trees, you could probably use that compost there. What you don't want to do is use that compost in your vegetable garden.
I could use it maybe on the flowers.
You could use it maybe on the flowers, and I've washed my hands well after. The biggest concern is I think it's a vector for human infection, that there are, bacteria diseases you can get. And I believe that that's, I'm not qualified. That's what I would do if it were my situation. Now here's my favorite dog waste story. We had a groundhog that was ceaseless. He was constantly digging around in the back of our lot, and we couldn't get rid of it. Well, my husband finally figured out, that looks like a really good hole to dump the dog waste in. And he consistently, for an entire summer, kept dumping dog waste in that groundhog's pile, and you know what? He moved away. He decided that was a really crappy neighborhood to live in. So again, I can't authorize that as really good advice, but it was pretty funny. I had to give it to him. Yes?
There's a lot of power in the hot pile when you're creating the hot compost, right?
A lot. She says there's a lot of
What I'm
power.
asking is, my husband gets our lawn tree or kennel, and the grass stuff, we don't put it out for the city hallway, but he puts it in another part of the back 40 where it's away from my composting, because I have a fit about that. But Marvin's composting, this is out 11 in Ohio.
Yeah.
Of course, he's got mountains. of
Yeah.
compost, but he's even thrown deer carcasses in there, and he swears it gets so hot that, after 3 weeks, you can't even find the pieces and parts. Now, I'm wondering, would grass that has been treated like with chemical, put in there, would the hot pile destroy enough, or would it reform itself into other
A chemical is a chemical, and I don't know why heat would make it chemically inert. I'm not a scientist, I'm a housewife.
question?
But that would be my answer. I wouldn't want to use it on my vegetables. Again, if you want to put that on your landscape, the stuff that you're not eating, I don't think it would be a big deal. But I wouldn't want to eat it on my vegetables. Yes?
I've been, for the most part, putting the leaves on my garden in the fall after I tear it down.
Right.
And I cover that up with sawdust horse manure.
Uh-huh.
And then I just leave it, and it covers with snow, and I
So you're
expect
row
it to
compost.
cook over the winter time.
Right.
But on the other hand, I have this gigantic pile. I have 5 acres in the country, which is back a ways from the house and all, in which case I put leaves, grass clippings with no chemicals, because I don't spray my yard,
Right.
and garbage and the likes of that. Meanwhile, that pile has grown to the size of a small car. I've never turned it, but I assume that some of the lower 2 or 3 feet of that has got to
Probably
be
great stuff.
10 or 12 years old.
Sure.
So, is that good?
It would be great stuff. Yeah. I would say that that's a passive pile. You've got a big passive pile, and if you kind of bulldoze the stuff off the top, the stuff down in it, I think you'd be amazed at how good that is, because it's well cooked by now.
Yeah.
It's taken a while. I did throw some cards over on the Mansfield Men's Garden Club. I keep a blog, and it's basically on the FloraQuest website, or you can find it if you Google the word weed picker. I must be the only person in the whole world that's willing to be called a weed picker. I don't know, yeah. Weed picker and Cheryl, and it'll come up every time. And, I put a lot of things on there, things that are going on in the yard and the garden, and birding events and butterfly events, horticulture events. We're doing a thing with Ohio Natural Areas and Preserves Association, and we're taking a special trip to go see the lakeside daisies, which is the rarest plant in Ohio. We only have them in Ohio and in Ontario, Canada, Marblehead, Ohio. So anyways, that information is on the blog if you're interested. There are little cards. These are from previous years, but the website address is still good. And they're over on the Men's Garden Club, because I like the Men's Garden Club. They're good guys.
I have
Yes.
2 questions for you. One question was, how are you actually composting in the wintertime when everything's covered up with snow and is hard and cold and
She's asking, how do I compost
how are
in the
you
winter
throwing
if it's hard
everything
and cold?
out? How are you throwing
Basically,
everything outside? And
you tromp out to the pile and I throw it on top because I'm hoping the crows will come in. I really do like the crows, you know. I've not had a problem like with mice or rats. I live out in the
so you
country.
just throw it on top?
I throw it on top and then if
Freeze
the crows
over
come and forage in it, that's okay by me. I think that's pretty cool.
And if it
Apparently
freezes
the
over,
crows are getting
freezes
the mice.
over, and
I'm
if
sorry.
it freezes over,
Oh, yeah, if it freezes
later
over.
when it thaws out, you just do whatever?
Right, you just turn it in the spring, like, you know, by tomorrow, it's supposed to be what, 50 again, 55?
And the second-
Our weather's on steroids,
The
if you
second
notice
question I
that.
had was, in the list of stuff not to put in there, you said not to put meat in it. Just to make sure that I'm correct in understanding, that does not mean, like when you break your table scraps in there, that does not mean cooked meat, is that correct?
They say if you follow, you know, if you go to the Master Gardener, if you go to OSU, they're gonna say don't put meat,
Not even
don't
cooked
put
meat?
cheese, don't put fatty items, don't put milk. Those kind of things should not go in your compost pile.
So no cheese,
Will the
no,
world come to an end if a little piece of meat scrap gets
does that
in
mean
there?
like not, no beans either, no meat?
No, beans can go in there.
Okay,
Yeah, beans would be fine.
okay,
Yeah.
so just no meat, no
No
cheese,
meat, no cheese,
milk?
no greasy, fatty
Okay.
materials, is what they say.
Okay.
So,
Basically, mostly like vegetable, what about like carbs and like
yeah, fine.
pasta?
Piece of bread, pasta, I don't think that would hurt a thing.
Okay.
Can't imagine that that would be a problem. Any other questions?
I have one.
Yeah.
You made it a point to mention that on the ragweed, it was before it was pollinating, it was before it had gone to seed. What if it had gone to seed? Do you recommend?
If it had gone, it's not so much if it had gone to seed. If it had gone to seed, then as I was yanking it down, cutting it down, the seeds would have fallen off and dispersed. So my whole plan was to get it before it went to seed. I didn't want it to seed in that area. That's what you want to do with weeds. If you have a weed that's a persistent problem, cut it down before it goes to seed. And tell yourself, okay, well, that might come back from the root, but that's just one plant that comes back. It's not 1,000 that came back from the seed, right? So you cut it down, you drag it away. Now, I wouldn't handle it if it was in the process of pollinating because I would get pretty sick from ragweed. That's why I wanted it off my property. That's a plant that gives me problems. And so I wanted to cut it down before it was pollinating. And if you look at pollen under a microscope, basically they'll tell you that the ragweed pollen has lots of jaggy edges, and that's why it causes congestion in humans. When you breathe it in, it has all these jaggy edges. So that was my whole plan, was to get rid of it before it was a problem. Yes, Paul?
We've all learned that pH is important in the soil, the range of pH. And growing up, my grandparents threw in two items at the opposite end of the pH, coffee grounds and eggshells, acidic and alkaline. So when you're pulling out your compost, are you concerned of the range or what your pH is going to be?
You know, that's a great question, but I've never considered it. So in 15 years, I've never considered it. I too throw in coffee grounds and I would throw in eggshells. So, I don't know. Yes?
I'm sorry, but also you said, like, you don't put animal waste in there, right?
Right.
A lot of people garden like with, what is it, like cow manure or horse
You can use
manure or
cow
whatever.
manure, you can use chicken or
And then-
rabbit.
Then I've heard like on Craigslist, excuse me, I'm sorry, I've seen on Craigslist here recently, somebody had wanting to give away, I think it was alpaca and horse manure for gardening. what's
I
your?
would say, I think horse is okay. I don't know alpaca offhand, probably is okay if it's dried out. I would say if you have questions like that, go to the OSU website.
OSU
And I'll bet you that you can find that out in very quick order. OhioLine.edu. And the Master Gardeners have some of the best research.
OhioLine.edu.
Yeah, like Ohio State University. Right.
You just don't want carnivorous animals, please. If they're eating grains or greens, that should be fine.
There you go.
The question I have is, I'm very allergic to poison ivy. How do you get rid of poison ivy?
Ooh, that's a good question. Yeah, I would think if you put it in your compost pile, you know, you could get, that would be one of those oils that could be pretty persistent. I don't know that I have a good answer for that. I mean, I've taken out small sections of poison ivy before, like you could cut it down. I don't get it, so I have to take it down. My mom used to get it real badly, so I would take it out, and I would usually paint some Roundup or something on the stump, you know, cut it, but I don't have any good answers. Check the Ohio line. I bet they have a good way of getting rid of poison ivy. I don't, and I don't think I put it in my compost. The other thing that I wouldn't compost real heavily would be a lot of walnut leaves. If the walnut leaves were mixed in with everything else, it would be okay. But if you had, say, a yard with only walnut trees, you know, that has juglans, which is a poisonous, you know, it's a chemical that's very hard on a lot of things like tomatoes. So that might change the pile if you got a lot of that juglans in. So a little bit would be okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard that you could use yeast to get your compost to get started. Have you ever heard that?
I haven't heard that. I have heard dog food before. He's asking about an accelerant for your compost pile. He's saying that he's heard yeast. Again, as a master gardener, it behooves me to follow the line and say, check the Ohio State website, because, you know, that's what that whole college was originally designed to do. It's an agricultural to find those answers.
I've also dumped like stale beer. You know, you pour a beer out and leave it set all day, leave the alcohol disappear, and then put it in your compost, and it'll start your compost with, it's got sugar and alcohol, or sugar and yeast in it.
Okay, so he's saying that he has dumped a stale beer. Now, I've never seen a stale beer at our house. He's saying that it works, so I just thought I'd let you know. Do you have a question?
I wanted to share, like she said, to contact the extension office, because some of us are gardening, some of us are market gardening, some of us are farming, and the rules are different. If you're selling food to people, you need to make sure you are following the right rules. But if you are just farming for yourself versus taking things to market, there's a huge difference on what you can and cannot compost. You could have your personal compost, but be clear that if you are someone who could possibly be audited, that you have the right kind of compost when they come around. And it also has to do with how far it can be away from the food you're growing for your personal garden, how far it can be away from the food you are growing for your public. So be clear about when you're composting, if you're composting for personal use or for market selling. I just wanted to share that.
That's a great comment, and there was a professional group that was named earlier, and I won't bring the name back up, but, and some of the things that they were doing that the person thought was questionable, and I do understand that they were cited, that they had some legal problems, that particular company had some legal problems because of some of the things they had in their compost. So, thanks, Jean. Give away some great prizes.